should get started and allow our speakers to take the stage. My name is John Martins. I direct the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's College. So welcome to the CCE and to St. Mark's College. Tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah Johnson on occasional religious practice and grassroots ecumenism. And her lecture will be followed by a panel discussion with Reverend Dr. Nick Meisl and Reverend Alisdair Smith. And there will be time for your questions after that as well. So I want to welcome you, to those of you who are here in person for this lecture. Thank you for traveling to be with us on our beautiful campus on the land of the Musqueam people. This is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and we're thankful for their welcome to us so that we can work and live and pray on their land and learn from the Musqueam people themselves. And our college is endeavoring to do this in numerous ways. And I want to welcome all of you who are watching this lecture on Zoom this evening. Welcome here as well. So the CCE is a center at St. Mark's College that stresses and emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we explore the Catholic and, broadly, the Christian intellectual tradition. And I want to offer thanks and gratitude for those who have sponsored this lecture and the center, including the Cullen family, Mark and Barbara, and for our donors to the center, Peter Bull, Angus Reid, and Andy Zox. And we're thankful for their commitment to the life of the academic world. Now, I always have a lot to say about the speakers, but I also like to turn it over to the speakers, but I do need to say something. The Reverend Canon Dr. Sarah Kathleen Johnson is Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Pastoral Theology at St. Paul University in Ottawa and the author of Occasional Religious Practice Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience. And that was published with Oxford University Press in 2025 this year. And so that's what she will be speaking on today, and that's what our panel will be responding to as well. Sarah's also an ordained Mennonite minister and has been made an honorary canon by the Anglican Church. She can talk more about that. Her research is at the intersection of liturgical studies and sociology of religion, and she explores Christian worship in a changing religious landscape, and maybe she'll talk about her current research as well at some point, or at least mention it, which is really interesting. And if you want to know more about it, you can listen to the Center's podcast, What Matters Most, because Sarah is the most recent guest on the podcast, talking about her new research of how young people worship. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame and has served as president of the Canadian Theological Society. And she's written a lot of material. She's worked on a Mennonite hymnal as well, Voices Together, and many other things. Father Nicholas Meisl was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Vancouver in 2013. He's my colleague here. And Sarah was my colleague here too for a short time. I should mention that. She was at Vancouver School of Theology and St. Mark's for a year before moving on to St. Paul's, where she is professor now. But Nick spent several years with the Missionaries of Charity Fathers serving in Tijuana, Mexico City, and Rome. And prior to teaching, he served in several parishes in Surrey and Richmond. Father Nick does a lot of work. He teaches at St. Mark's and Corpus Christi colleges, teaches New Testament and Old Testament. He just defended his doctoral dissertation at Durham University, where he researched the Apostle Paul's views on sexuality, marriage, and singleness under the supervision of Professors John Barclay and Harry Meyer of the Vancouver School of Theology. And he also currently serves at St. Peter's Parish in Westminster. I didn't even mention that he teaches at Christ the King Seminary as well. He's part of what we now call the gig economy, I think. He's got a number of things going on. Reverend Alisdair Smith serves as school chaplain at the Vancouver School of Theology. He was previously deacon and business chaplain at Christ Church Cathedral in downtown Vancouver. Those of you who know that beautiful church, you know that beautiful location too in downtown Vancouver. He worked for many years in the credit union sector in Canada and globally, exploring governance, leadership, and strategy. And he's currently researching how hospitality does and could function in church life and ministries. A lifelong Anglican, he's ordained as a deacon. So I want to turn it over to Sarah now and let her explain her research. And I want to thank you, Sarah, for joining us today, for traveling from Ottawa to be with us.
Good evening. I am delighted to be back at the Center for Christian Engagement. I had the honor of giving a public lecture here in 2022 when I was a postdoctoral fellow at St. Mark's College and Vancouver School of Theology. At that time, I was finalizing the manuscript of the book that came out this past June with Oxford University Press, Occasional Religious Practice, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience. The book is now available through most university libraries as an Oxford academic ebook, so you can find it by searching the University of British Columbia Library catalog. You could also purchase the book using this 30% off discount code. I'm pleased to be speaking about occasional religious practice again tonight, and I'm especially grateful for this opportunity to be in conversation with two colleagues, with Nick and Alisdair, who are both scholars and practitioners. And our specific focus this evening is the informal grassroots relationships that can emerge between Christian traditions, especially the Catholic and Anglican traditions, in the context of occasional religious practice. To begin, a story. Beth has a Roman Catholic background and has become skeptical of the tradition. She identifies as a non-practicing Catholic who is spiritual and feminist. Her husband was likewise raised Roman Catholic and now identifies as an atheist. Beth and her husband deliberately chose not to be married in the Catholic Church. When their daughter is born, it becomes clear that baptism is very important to the grandmothers of the child, although they attend Mass only occasionally. Upon reflection, Beth realizes that baptism is important to her too. However, she is committed to pursuing it in a way that reflects her values and lifestyle. She initially reaches out to the Roman Catholic Church, calling multiple parishes and encountering various roadblocks: required attendance, proof of living within parish bounds, meeting with priests, and more. She then calls the Anglican parish around the corner from her home and is welcomed warmly. Beth is impressed by having women in leadership and by the genuine personal connection offered by clergy. Beth and her husband decide to celebrate the baptism at the Anglican parish. Her Roman Catholic sister and brother-in-law, who have become more religious since their Catholic wedding, serve as the godparents. 50 family members attend the baptism service and the extravagant celebration afterwards. They are impressed with the Anglican ritual, calling it a royal baptism, a reference to the baptisms of members of the British royal family. And they also say, "It feels like I'm in Italy. It feels like I'm at the Vatican." Beth is one example of an occasional religious practitioner with Catholic background who turns to the Anglican tradition to baptize her child. Beth never attended another Anglican liturgy, either before or after the baptism. Occasional religious practice is a way of relating to religion that is defined by participation in religious practices occasionally rather than routinely, usually in connection with certain types of occasions. Occasional religious practice is defined in contrast to routine religious practice. There are also those who are more intensive in their practice, and there is the possibility of never participating in religious practices. These are relative categories that are defined contextually and may change over time. 4 types of occasions are associated with occasional religious practice. Holidays are important to occasional practitioners, such as Christmas and Easter. Life transitions are also central for many occasional practitioners, including birth, marriage, and death. Times of personal or communal crisis are an occasion for religious practice. And finally, incidental circumstances, such as attending evensong as a tourist or providing transportation to an aging parent, may be occasions for religious practice. I introduce and develop the concept of occasional religious practice, drawing on 3 years of ethnographic research. I conducted fieldwork in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, including 61 interviews. I observed more than 80 Anglican liturgies in a diversity of communities. I'm very grateful to the clergy and the participants who supported this research. Their stories are the foundation of a robust and nuanced concept of occasional religious practice. Participants in this research describe their religious identities in many different ways. All of them were present at Anglican baptisms or funerals, among other occasions for Christian worship. Of course, some participants in Anglican practices do identify as Anglican, whether because of past or present belief and practice, or cultural heritage and family background, or personal choice. Some participants in Anglican practices affiliate with other expressions of Christianity, including Roman Catholicism, and understand their religious identities in a similar range of ways, in connection with past or present belief and practice, or cultural heritage and family background, or personal choice. This includes the sister and brother-in-law in this story who serve as godparents, who identify as practicing Catholics. The grandmothers of the child have a strong sense of Catholic identity that is linked to cultural heritage and family background, although it is not associated with routine practice. Occasional participants may also identify simply as Christian, or may identify with non-Christian religious traditions. Furthermore, occasional practitioners may claim a range of non-religious identities. They may identify as spiritual, to indicate a sense of spiritual connection in their lives, or to point to participation in alternative spiritual practices, or simply to suggest that they are non-religious but not anti-religious. Beth identifies as spiritual. Some occasional practitioners identify as atheist or agnostic or are indifferent to religion. This includes Beth's husband, who identifies as an atheist. Attention to occasional religious practice reveals that this is the eclectic mixture of participants in Christian worship in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, and specifically in attendance at this baptism. With this tremendous diversity present in the room, it is unsurprising that there are diverse motivations for occasional participation. I develop a taxonomy of types of occasional practitioners. These types are associated with situational roles and motivations, not stable identity categories. Occasional practitioners include initiators who bring about the practice. For example, Beth initiated the baptism of her child. Initiators may be motivated by cultural heritage. A strong sense of Italian Catholic identity is a factor in this case. They may be motivated by a specific relational connection, such as the encouragement of the grandmothers. Some may be motivated by a desire for spiritual connection, space for reflection, or to express gratitude. Initiators may also be invisibly routine, meaning they practice privately but not publicly, and therefore appear occasional. Very few of the occasional practitioners I interviewed were invisibly routine. In addition, there are those who are involuntarily occasional, meaning they desire to practice routinely, but barriers beyond their control prevent them from doing so, such as depending on others for transportation. Occasional practice is not always a choice. In contrast to initiators, some occasional practitioners are supporters. Advocates encourage occasional practice without being in a position to initiate it. For example, the grandmothers who advocate for the baptism of Beth's child. Inner circles supporters may have central roles, despite having little personal investment in the practice. This includes Beth's husband, who makes faith commitments alongside his partner on behalf of their child. Outer circle supporters tend not to have leadership responsibilities, like most of the 50 family members who attended this baptism. Catalysts include the infant being baptized. They bring about the practice, but can neither directly initiate nor support it. Occasional practice is shaped by complex motivations and circumstances. These motivations are personal and social, spiritual and cultural, although these dimensions of human experience are often difficult to differentiate. Each type of occasional practice is substantial. None of these types of occasional religious practice can be easily dismissed. These practices are meaningful and purposeful for participants. It is inaccurate and unhelpful to assume that legitimate religious practice consists primarily of individual cognitive assent and routine or intensive participation. Occasional practice in its diversity is a significant and very ordinary way of relating to religion. In the book and elsewhere, I argue that occasional religious practice is not a new phenomenon. It can be found throughout the history of the Christian tradition. However, it is widespread in contemporary contexts. What I call occasional religious practice is a common thread that runs through the literature on religious change in Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, and Australia. The limited quantitative data we have in Canada suggests that it is an extremely widespread way of relating to religion today. So now that we have a shared understanding of what I mean by occasional religious practice, I would like to explore the kinds of grassroots ecumenical connections that may emerge on these occasions, especially between the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions. For an ethnographic study based in the Anglican tradition, I was initially surprised that 9 of the 41 people I interviewed had a Roman Catholic background, and how often I heard about Roman Catholicism from other participants as well. In retrospect, perhaps this could have been expected. Roman Catholicism is the largest religious tradition in Toronto, in Canada, and worldwide. It is a tradition that is present in civic life in Ontario in a particular way due to the publicly funded Catholic school system. And it is an expression of Christianity that receives significant ongoing media attention. However, more than any of these factors, I suspect it is the overlap between the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions, and especially the Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems, that likely accounts for the prevalence of the Roman Catholic tradition in interviews with people who practice occasionally in the Anglican tradition. Before I go further, there are 2 important caveats to keep in mind. First, it is crucial to keep in mind that this analysis centers on how participants perceive the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions, not how these traditions describe themselves, either officially or unofficially. My goal is not to present Anglican or Roman Catholic church teaching, but to describe how ordinary people experience and understand these 2 traditions. Second, it is crucial to keep in mind that the participants in this research were selected because they chose to engage in ritual practices in the Anglican tradition, and they were open to speaking about those experiences. People who choose to participate in Roman Catholic practices may have very different perceptions of the 2 traditions, and that is beyond the scope of this study. Participants in this research frequently make comparisons between the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions, and when doing so, they consistently communicate 2 things. Anglicans and Catholics are pretty much the same, and Anglicans and Catholics are very different. Many participants describe how the Anglican and Catholic traditions are similar in general terms. Anglican and Roman Catholic services look pretty much the same. Others provide concrete examples of parallels between the traditions that draw on their own liturgical experience. The Anglican Mass was more or less how I remember it in our church, the Roman Catholic Church. I didn't even need the booklet. I remembered all the words. At the same time, participants in interviews describe Anglicans and Catholics as very different. These perceptions of difference are sometimes rooted in observable liturgical practices, with a common one being the role of women in liturgical leadership. Participants also perceive there to be differences in popular understandings of church teachings on contentious social issues such as abortion and birth control, as well as on theological matters such as the role of the Pope or Mary. More often, however, these differences that participants identify between Roman Catholic and Anglican practices are associated with the mood or attitude that they experience within and beyond the liturgy. Rather than being anchored in specific observable differences in practice or teaching, this reflects a subtler, more emotional, evocative dimension of liturgical experience. Participants use words like cold, strict, rigid, and formal to describe Catholic ritual, and warm, welcoming, personal, and informal to describe Anglican ritual, while at the same time stating that the practices are almost identical. The Anglican clergy I interview are aware of the similarities and differences between the traditions, and that the Anglican Church may be a place for occasional and even routine religious practice among Catholics. Quote, "We do get a fair number of people who have more of a Catholic background because they find here a liturgical expression which is familiar, but with some significant differences." One framework that is helpful for understanding these dynamics is the theory of ritual systems introduced by Catherine Bell. On the surface, the concept of ritual systems is common sense. Ritual practices relate to other ritual practices and systems. Relationships within and between systems interpret and reinterpret ritual practices, informing the meanings and functions of rituals for participants. Participants do not primarily rely on theological explanations of a practice that they have been taught in order to interpret that practice. Instead, they rely on experiences of connection to other related ritual practices. These experiences of connection may include experiences of repetition, praying the prayer Jesus taught in both the Catholic Mass and Anglican Eucharist. They may be experiences of opposition, a priest who presents as female rather than male. Experiences of centrality, the dense networking of baptism in both the Roman Catholic and Anglican ritual systems. They include experiences of ritual systems nesting. For example, both the Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems are part of a broader Christian ritual system, and of ritual systems overlapping. Most central to this conversation is the overlaps between the Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems. There are certain rituals that are shared between the two systems, while other rituals remain unique to each system. Another story. Dora grew up in a small town in Bavaria that is deeply Roman Catholic. When her son is born in Toronto, she knows immediately that she wants to return to her hometown and baptize him in her home parish. The specific repetitions within this ritual system are essential for her. The same priest that baptized her would baptize her child in the same building, in the same tradition, giving her son a connection to family, culture, and homeland. At the same time, Dora desires to connect her Canadian family-in-law to this event, including her husband, who identifies as Anglican by heritage, although he has never practiced routinely, and her sister-in-law, Danielle, whom they have chosen to be the son's godmother. However, the Catholic priest in Dora's home parish requires godparents to be baptized. Danielle identifies as spiritual and recognizes the Christian heritage of her family, yet has never practiced routinely. Before Danielle was born, her parents had a negative experience in marriage preparation at an Anglican parish, which pushed them both away from the church. When Danielle was born, her mother decided to baptize her by herself at home with water in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There is, of course, no formal record of this baptism. In order to serve as the godmother of her nephew at his Roman Catholic baptism, Danielle decides to pursue a second baptism as an adult in her local Anglican parish. Dora and Danielle ensure that this baptism will be recognized by the Roman Catholic priest in Bavaria, who formally acknowledges the overlap of these ritual systems. Danielle's mother, who has had very occasional connections to the parish over the years, nervously reaches out about the possibility of the baptism. The whole family meets with the priest and is overwhelmed by the compassionate and understanding response. They are also delighted by the progressive theology of the parish, especially its affirmation of the LGBTQ+ community. Even Dora expresses that it is more resonant with her values than her community of origin. Yet this adult baptism was never about theological conviction or routine practice. When Danielle is baptized during a Sunday liturgy, the priest introduces her to the community and explains she is doing it for love. Numerous occasional practitioners, Dora and her husband, Danielle and her mother, astutely negotiate the overlaps between the Roman Catholic and Anglican ritual systems. They exercise agency in systems controlled by others. In the Anglican system, they find a practical flexibility necessary to meet the formal requirements they encounter in the Roman Catholic ritual system. The case of Anglican baptisms in Toronto demonstrates the complex relationship between the Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems in this setting, as well as the intricate ways in which these and other ritual systems overlap, including the ritual systems associated with family, ethnicity, popular culture, and other Christian traditions. It is clear in these accounts that baptism matters intensely to occasional practitioners. The occasional practitioners in these narratives, especially the initiators, advocates, and inner circle supporters, are very invested in the practice taking place and are willing to go to great lengths to facilitate it. Occasional practitioners reflect deeply on how to baptize their children and intuitively negotiate ritual systems and practices they often would not have the theological language to describe. Clergy are also an important part of this story and respond to requests for baptism in a diversity of ways. Small interactions with clergy contribute to strongly felt impressions of the Anglican and Roman Catholic ritual systems. How clergy respond matters to occasional practitioners, especially in these moments of crisis. And crisis is a helpful framework for understanding practices associated with life transitions, including baptism. These are significant ministry opportunities. Finally, these narratives at the intersection of the Roman Catholic and Anglican ritual systems reveal patterns associated with the changing religious landscape in Toronto. We see the emergence of a grassroots ecumenism, a type of relationship among Christian traditions that would have been inconceivable a century ago. Anglican rituals may be substituted for Catholic rituals for occasional practitioners, at least in certain cases. One final story. Eden is a routine practitioner in both the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions. She identifies as Roman Catholic and her husband is Anglican. When their young family immigrated to Canada from Jamaica a few years ago, her husband chose a local Anglican church for the family to attend weekly. Their children attend a local Catholic school. When their son is born in Canada, the priest, family, and parishioners at the Anglican parish simply assume he will be baptized. After all, they are routine practitioners in this community. I interview Eden about this baptism. However, as I wrap up the interview, she casually asks if I would like to hear about the other baptism. A couple of months after the baptism at the Anglican Church, her son was also baptized in a local Catholic parish. Eden explains how, when she and her husband married, they made a commitment to baptize their children in the Roman Catholic Church, and Eden is determined to keep this promise. Eden did her research. She was aware that baptism is not supposed to be repeated, and that Roman Catholics recognize Anglican baptism. She emphasizes that she personally believes in the validity of Anglican baptism. Nevertheless, Eden and her husband pursue baptism in both traditions. The Catholic Church did not ask whether her son was already baptized. As Eden says, nobody thinks you'll baptize your child twice. I was certainly surprised by the second baptism. It points to a different expression of grassroots ecumenism, in which rituals are not substituted across traditions, but instead multiple religious practices are taking place. I'm very curious what Nick and Alisdair make of the complex dynamics in these real-life stories that often do not fit tidy theological frameworks or established patterns of practice. Occasional religious practice, as a widespread way of relating to religion, is important for understanding a contemporary religious landscape in which participants engage in ongoing negotiation of multiple overlapping ritual systems in sometimes surprising ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. As you know, I have lots of questions. I've said some of them to you already, but what we're going to do is we're going to have Nick give a short response, and then Alisdair will give a short response. Then I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the panel, and then we'll open it up to you, because I'm sure folks have a number of questions as well. But thank you so much. There's a lot to think about here. And as a theologian, myself, there's just a kind of almost like a sandpaper quality. It's like, no, the way things should be is like this. You sort of can't help it. That's what I do. But what's interesting is we're dealing with real life experiences and real life people and choices they have made, and I'm fascinated to hear from Nick and Alisdair.
Yeah, go for it. So thank you very much, Sarah. It's great to connect again, and wonderful to meet you, Alisdair. So thank you very much for the presentation and for your work and for your research. So I'd like to comment a bit, kind of put on my pastor hat. I've been pastor now at St. Peter's Parish in New Westminster, a Catholic parish, just over 3 years. And when I first arrived at the parish had just gone through the synod discussions, listening circles. This was a large process, and at St. Peter's, this was before I came, so I can't take credit for this, but they had a great buy-in to the synodal listening sessions. And so we had people from different backgrounds, the elderly, the young. They were even able to get parents who were involved in the catechism program, and some of those might fall in to this category that we're talking about, occasional religious practitioners. So first of all, when I was reading Sarah's great work, part of it is a sense of gratitude for being able to hear from these voices that we probably didn't hear from when we were having the synodal sessions, because they wouldn't even really hear that those were occurring. So to hear their viewpoints, hear their perspectives is very, very valuable. And it's difficult at times to get kind of the pulse or the read on what people are thinking or experiencing. And so it's very valuable for myself as a pastor to hear these perspectives and to learn from them, especially the way that they would had their experiences in the Catholic Church and how that contrasted in Anglican communities as well, especially that sense of welcome that they felt is certainly something we also would want others to feel. And certainly as well, the experience or the voice that they were giving about what they hoped to see in the Catholic Church would also resonate with the synodal listening that we had, particularly the role of women in the Church was a large kind of point that came forward at St. Peter's Parish, and I know also more globally. For me personally, it was also a challenge to read these stories, because you hear them and sort of my first response is, well, that's not my experience of the Catholic Church. And I know that that is the case at times, unfortunately, but it's also, hasn't always corresponded to what we try to do, or I think the experience of many different people. So some of that at times is difficult to hear and to process for myself kind of personally, but to recognize as well. I think when I hear those stories, trying to get baptism in a Catholic Church, getting rejected, going to another place, this happens as well. And I think to acknowledge that. And to think then, I think for myself, what do we do with these experiences? How do we learn from them? How do we process them? That seems like a tension to me. There's certain things, for example, that occasional religious practitioners want to see in the Catholic Church that if I were to ask other Catholics in the Church, they wouldn't want to see. So how do we correspond, or how do we deal with that tension that is there? A big question for me that comes up as well, or to consider, and it's a challenge, do we want to see occasional religious practicers become more frequent religious practicers? And if so, how does that happen? What does that look like? And baptisms have been, for me, an incredible blessing at the parish and an opportunity where we are interacting with people who are very occasional in their religious practice. And there's been so many wonderful examples of where, they felt welcome in the parish. We try to have the baptisms happening during a Sunday liturgy. I explain, the vibe is better, there's more excitement there, and they feel very much connected with the community. And indeed, for many of them, they do come and begin to become more regular in their practice, which I see as being a good kind of thing. There is a tension that I experience as well with how do we always, if someone comes for us for baptism, for example, can we always say yes? Or there's that kind of sense that if we don't say yes, we're not being welcoming. In the Catholic Church, in our tradition, in our baptism, we begin by asking a few questions. We ask the parents, what name have you given your child? And then we ask them, what do you ask of God's church for your child? And the response is baptism. And then the next question, in asking for baptism for your child, you are undertaking the responsibility of raising your child in the faith. Do you understand this responsibility? And that really is a complicated question because that can be interpreted in various ways. And probably I think that comes across in the experience that some Catholics would have had approaching different Catholic parishes. What does it mean to raise your child in the faith? And oftentimes I will have a conversation with those who are occasionally practicing their faith about what that might look like for them. And I've had interesting experiences with people as well who have maybe come from a different parish and are coming because they weren't allowed to have the baptism done there. And oftentimes there's kind of a tension to walk as well, in that we want to be welcome, we want to be open and accepting, but I've had other opportunities where I wonder what the balance is between trying to maybe encourage that question, which I would see as a responsibility of raising the faith, with being welcoming. So I'll give some examples I've had, and this becomes actually more frequent than I've thought. I've encountered various couples where they're coming and wanting to baptize their child on a specific day, and it's a year after their child's birth, and it happens to be the baptism of their child, the birthday of their child. And they will have approached a particular parish and asked to do it on that day, and then for whatever reasons are told they can't, so they come to our parish. And to do it, then I kind of have to ask some questions, because part of it is, well, I don't know the relationship they have at that other parish. They might be under pastoral care of the other people at that parish. Part of me would like to just say yes and go ahead with it. Part of it I try to encourage, we need to make sure that this is a decision too where they are going to raise the child Catholic. But then the response is the hall is already booked, we have everything ready to go, and so they're going to do it on that day. And there's times where, we try to delay perhaps, or to move forward. And it's not an experience I like to do. I think maybe it could be interpreted as being unwelcoming. But I think for me it is a tension, and it's something I'm not entirely comfortable with to know what to do with always. Because certainly, people coming have a desire to baptize their child. I think that's a wonderful thing. But how do we lead them maybe to a further practice of the faith can be challenging. So that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, John, for the invitation. Very, very kind. I have a couple of thoughts. How much time have we got? No, I'm just kidding. So the first thing is, I'd like to start with a story. So back in 2019, my wife and I, my partner and I, were walking part of the Camino Santiago. And we walked the last 100 and so kilometers so we could get the little piece of paper. But on the way, we went to a number of masses. And Olivia would come to the cathedral if I was preaching. I'm not sure she fits exactly the occasional person, but close enough. She'd come to the cathedral where I was on staff at the time, Christ Church Cathedral, and she would come if I was preaching. But she wouldn't take communion for various reasons. So we're on this Camino road, and before we left, we went to a mass at the place we were in, and all of a sudden, I realized that Olivia is weeping. And what's going on? She says, I have no idea. I just feel like weeping. So we go on the trek, and then we stop in at a place, and we go to another mass. She's weeping. Now, she has never wept at Christ Church Cathedral, but she's weeping. We wind up we get to Santiago, and we go to the Spanish Mass. She's weeping. The next day we go to the English Mass, not weeping. We go to Madrid. We go to the big, beautiful new cathedral in Madrid. There was a cardinal there. It was very cool. In Spanish, she's weeping. What do you think was going on for her? Why would she be weeping at a Spanish Mass, not weeping at an English Mass? What we came to understand was that there were words in the English Mass that were tripping her up. Words like sin, words like father. And she would hear the word and she would go down a rabbit hole. That's my way of describing it, darling. Where I'm going with this is that we have rituals in place that there are narratives about, if I can put it that way. We've got the ritual, and then we've got the narrative about the ritual. And that we're not necessarily allowing each other to just sit in the mystery. Just to sit in the mystery. The second piece that struck me about your work, Sarah, is my friend Ellen Clark King, who was with me, worked with me at Christ Church Cathedral, and is now the dean at King's College in London. And in her work, she coined the term choral theology. C-H-O-R-A-L, theology. Now, what she found was that the theology that was being generated by the women that she was studying was a perfectly valid and moving and touching theology, but it wasn't coming from people who were like you, Sarah, or Nick, or I. It was the community generating its own theology. What these two stories lead me to is, what's the place of hospitality here? How can we, from whatever religious tradition we might be from, when people are coming into our spaces, what does hospitality look like for us? I think, too, we've been talking a lot about baptisms. The other place is funerals. In fact, I'm preaching at a funeral I discovered today on Saturday. Part of my job is to welcome people who have not been in a church since they were children, because their aunt has died. How do we do that? I think that the big question for us is, how do we create space so that people can live in mystery in the midst of a world that tries to explain everything? And people are hungry, I believe, for mystery. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
So Sarah, did you want to respond at all to the two panelists before we move on to other questions?
Sure. Well, thank you both for your very thoughtful, generous remarks, for the stories that you've added to the stories we've already heard. There's so much I could say in response. But maybe I'll say a little bit about hospitality first, which I think is a theme that both of you raised in different ways. And I think one thing I would say about that is when I think about occasional practice, hospitality, welcome, is not always about saying yes to everything. And there are a lot of ways to be kind and compassionate and pastoral, and also sometimes need to say no, need to present other options, need to provide introductions to other communities. And that I think there are ways to be warm and comforting and caring that don't necessarily involve facilitating the practice, especially if it is somehow compromising your own leadership or in tradition in some way. There are other ways to extend care. So I just want to acknowledge that up front, that hospitality takes many different forms that aren't necessarily saying yes. The other thing that I would mention is one of the main ways that I approach occasional religious practice in this book is by emphasizing dialogue, and dialogue among people who relate to religion in different ways. And how much, sometimes, yes, there may be leaders, there may be congregations that really want to kind of convert occasional practitioners into routine practitioners, and maybe sometimes that happens. But most of the occasional practitioners who I speak with are very content with their current way of relating to religion. And sometimes that kind of pressure can lead to very performative interactions or very kind of instrumental approaches to these practices. So to think about how that can be a human encounter, a dialogue, an opportunity for mutual learning. I think that connects with what you were saying, Alisdair, about mystery too. When I think about the kinds of things that I learn from occasional practitioners, there are three really deep themes that run through my conversations with occasional practitioners in the Diocese of Toronto. One is liturgy as material more than verbal, much more of a focus on those nonverbal aspects of Christian ritual practice. Another is liturgy is more emotional than intellectual. It's less about understanding and more about being able to interact effectively into that space. And then it's relational rather than personal, not really about personal preference or desires, but about how we are in relationship with each other, and it's often relationships that are most significant on these occasions too. And I think that those aspects get at that mystery in different ways, and sort of learning about those mysterious dimensions of liturgy is something I've really received through dialogue with occasional practitioners.
Thank you.
So I'm only going to take the opportunity to ask two of my 20 questions. The first one, I'm going to ask Father Nick, because we've heard about Roman Catholics at Anglican services. Nick, how would you determine the needs of someone from another religious tradition who's worshiping with you or seeking a sacrament or other religious service from you? Because I know that this happens because I entered the Catholic Church. And the first time I went to talk to a Catholic priest about this, I was a student at St. Michael's. And I won't mention the name of this priest, but he was at the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies. And I said, I think I'd like to join the Catholic Church. And he said, well, it's not a country club. Maybe join was the wrong word, because it was sort of interesting. So, I mean, that might be seen as unwelcoming, but I think he was asking me to think about what I was asking and to reflect on it. So if someone comes to you from another religious tradition, how do you respond? I mean, is it just in the moment, or are there things you're looking for?
Right. No, thanks, John. That's a great question. Yeah, I can think of examples. We have our RCIA program, so there's a couple people in that right now from the Anglican tradition. But in previous years, sometimes too, to kind of investigate and journey with the individuals, because also they will come oftentimes with their experiences of things that they, like the Catholics in this studies, that they did not like in the Anglican tradition, and then they come to the Catholic tradition. So to be honest and say, okay, like what you maybe were uncomfortable with there, you also might find here. So to kind of be honest, that I don't want to set people up for double disappointment, you know? So to have like an honest conversation. But I think different priests would handle it differently. But that's kind of, to try to understand their experience and to respect it. But I don't want to present it like we're going to solve all their, it's wonderful that they're making that decision, but to kind of, to learn and to think about what they went through there, but also to recognize it might also, what maybe they did not find satisfying there, it could also, be their experience as well, because people are similar and different.
So this is a question for all of you, really as practitioners, because I take your point, Sarah, that occasional religious practitioners are presenting as satisfied with their experience and where they're at. But if people who attend a church occasionally desire spiritual guidance from you, how do you go about that in terms of giving spiritual guidance? That is, if there's a routine practitioner, intensive practitioner, it might be easier. They know the routines as well of the church or the parish. But do people who practice occasionally sometimes come to you for spiritual guidance? And this would be a question for all three of you. How do you work that out? What can you offer? What's the process?
I'll take a stab. So in my work as the business chaplain at Christ Church Cathedral, which evolved into a lot of conversations on airplanes, because my work in credit union land took me across the country and down into the US. And so I would have these I often wore my collar, as a matter of fact, and I would have these very, very profound conversations with people from all walks of life. And the guiding principle for me was meet them where they're at. Just meet them where they're at. There was I remember being in a hotel meeting room where, and it's interesting, it was a Roman Catholic guy who had gone through a very messy divorce, and it was very sad. And he had walked into his parish and had been by his parish priest had been refused communion. And not to get into a debate or but to meet him where he was at, and to be a non-judgmental, honest person of faith beside him in the midst of that pain. That's about as far as I can go on it. Just meet them where they're at. I hope that makes some sense.
Oh, sounds good. I mean, I would concur.
So what I'll do is I'll bring the microphone around. If there are any questions from folks, keep them succinct so that as many people as want to ask questions in our remaining time have an opportunity to. Any other responses or questions before I start asking folks?
Sorry. Sarah, I think you're really onto something about hospitality is not necessarily, come on in. I mean, it can be at that level. But if we think, and I appreciate that you're a church historian kind of guy, so I may be wrong on this. But my understanding is that in the early church, you didn't just show up and get baptized. It was a journey to get baptized. There was a process that you went through, and that's what welcomed you into the community. And I wonder if we've fallen into a trap of trying to be more about a consumerist kind of thing than I'd be curious about your thoughts.
Yes, yeah. Well, we could talk a lot more about the history of the practice of baptism, which might be beyond the scope of this evening. But in terms of consumerism, I'm really quite hesitant to put occasional religious practice in that category. And that's partly because it's often not a matter of personal preference. It's often wrapped up in these complex relational dynamics and complex cultural dynamics in a sense of spiritual longing. There's a lot going on there that isn't really about what I want. That is really about something that's bigger than one person's desires or preferences. I think in many ways it actually really challenges consumer framings of religion in that way, and that it pushes back on things like Bella's Sheilaism, or the way consumerism is written about by Vincent Miller. Like it's not that kind of way of engaging with religion. It's much more social and relational than that individualistic model.
Okay, thank you.
This is mostly for Sarah, but I don't know, have you followed the trajectory of persons who have been baptized in a tradition other than the one that maybe was their parents, and how they would look back on that later in life? You probably haven't had more than 4 or 5 years to look at these cases, so it may be speculative, but what do you think a child would feel like about their baptism when they grow up?
Well, it's not a question I can answer in terms of this specific ethnographic research. It's really, these are interviews I do at one point in time. There's no longitudinal aspect to this. But I can certainly consider how the people who I interview about baptizing their children think about their own baptisms. And that's often one of the repetitions that is most important for them, thinking about how they're interpreting practices through repetitions in ritual systems. Very often it's, I was baptized, and that means something to me, and that means something to my parents who were baptized, and to my grandparents who were baptized, and my own children are part of that repetition of baptism. And that's one of those key interpretive frameworks, is a sense of valuing their own baptism in some sense. And advocates are often speaking in those terms as well, because of that way of interpreting ritual through repetitions, and those are the ones that are really, really close to them. They also sometimes imagine what their children will think about the baptism in the future, and think about, oh, I wouldn't want my child to want to get married in the Catholic Church and not have that opportunity, or to want to go to a Catholic school and not have that opportunity. So they can kind of see it as creating opportunities that their children may choose to accept in the future. That's one of the big differences in how clergy and occasional practitioners understand baptism, is that clergy often interpret it as making a commitment to raise the child in the faith now, in the present, whereas parents and godparents tend to interpret it as making it an opportunity that children can choose to pursue in the future if they wish to. So there's that interpretation of the ritual system is different because people are positioned in it in different ways.
Hello, hi, thank you for coming. I might have a couple of quick questions. First of all, in terms of occasional religious practices, that means basically, should we not reach out to should we not encourage formal worship, regular worship, or just accept the fact that they're just occasional? So it could be, so is that grounds for evangelization, or just grounds for, laissez-faire? Second question is, in your taxonomy, one category was involuntary, occasional. Can you please help me understand that? Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Well, I can speak to the involuntary occasional question first. So this is recognizing that occasional religious practice is not always a choice. Probably the most common instance of this is people, as they get older, are no longer able to participate routinely when they once did, often because of disability or questions of access. But that's not always associated with aging. People experience disability in many ways and forms at different times in their life. There may also be other factors at play there. Sometimes there are tensions in families that make it very difficult for one person to participate if the rest of the family is not supportive of that. So it's those kinds of dynamics. And I think often we think about, it's just entirely a free individual's choice whether or not they're engaging in religious practices. And there's more to those stories. In terms of encouraging more routine practice, that's not how I approach occasional religious practice in my own work. I really think about it more in terms of the same way we might think about interreligious dialogue or ecumenical dialogue in terms of encounter among difference and how we learn from one another, both about the others and also about ourselves through those encounters. So I tend to approach occasional religious practice through that dialogical model of thinking about people relate to religion in different ways, in a way that's similar to how people relate to different religious traditions or different expressions of Christianity. And how do we encounter one another in the midst of those differences and learn through those encounters? And sometimes, well, in fact, most of the time, I think we're changed through them, and others are changed through them as well. But I'm hesitant in terms of how I work with this, to approach it primarily in terms of evangelization for that reason.
Just before your question, Nick or Alisdair, did you want to respond to that?
I think for myself, I want to encourage people to practice more, and it's also, I think, like baptism especially is becoming part of a community, and to be welcoming, I think is good, but like, I kind of have the same when I'm kind of careful with people who come and then did not get what they wanted at another place, because then it's, I don't know what happened there, and then, okay, maybe if they can't get baptized in our community, they go somewhere else. And I don't know if that will continue to the next. Like, will the children who are baptized under those circumstances choose to baptize their children? I don't know. I think, it strikes me. I don't know how we can balance what someone wants and what the community wants, or what the community kind of has certain expectations. Baptism for me isn't merely like a personal decision.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It shows up for me not so much around baptism, but funerals, where I'll hear colleagues saying, "Oh, we had so many people at the funeral. It was a great evangelical moment. We could have brought them all." No, the funeral is about the present moment for these people in this, right? Don't just be present with them.
Yeah, I would see that as evangelization, right? Like to be that warmth, that presence. It's tricky. Like I said, it raises like kind of conflicts for me.
Thank you. I was interested to hear what all three of you said. This is a question primarily for Sarah, but it's sparked by something that Reverend Alisdair has talked about as far as funerals. Because I've told some people here before that I'm an example of someone who had become just an occasional, Catholic until 13 years ago when my father died, and I really felt the funeral is what really brought me back. I realized it was something mysterious, something awesome, something bigger than us, and also something that I felt had been missing. So basically, I describe it as the ritual came first, and then the faith followed, and then I ended up getting a master's degree in theology. So there was a progression there. So my question then for Sarah is, it sounds like at first it sounds like a good news story about that couple that was welcomed into the Anglican Church. They seemed to have a positive experience. They had a nice baptism. The family was happy. 50 people showed up. And even if you don't evangelize or that's not the focus, did you ever find out from any of them why? I think you said they never came back. I wonder why, or if they had a good experience and they were attracted to the church, I wonder why they never came back after that, why it was a one-off. Whereas for me, for example, just anecdotally, but like I said, I I did come back because of that. So.
Yes, and I think this is already a good example of how many different responses to an occasional practice can emerge. Actually, what surprised me most about this family is that they never visited the church before the baptism, and the baptism took place during a Sunday morning liturgy. So I was surprised that they didn't check it out before choosing to go this direction. But I was less surprised that they didn't return, because this baptism was not about routine practice for them. It wasn't about becoming Anglican. It was about relationships within their family. It was about belonging in culture. It was about a sense of spiritual connection. So it wasn't about alignment with a specific tradition or participating regularly in that parish. So certainly there are times when these kinds of ritual encounters can be transformative, and I certainly don't want to deny that possibility or foreclose it in any way. I think one of the challenges comes when leaders expect that, when it's like, oh, because they're here for the baptism, now I have to transform this into something else, and then they feel like they've failed when that doesn't happen. So I don't think that family didn't come back because the priest did anything wrong, right? Like that it's not their fault. It's not that it wasn't a really significant moment for that couple, for their extended family, but it wasn't something that they were seeking, that long-term connection to a parish. So I think a lot of it's really about maybe being attentive to our expectations of what emerges, and recognizing a range of different possibilities may emerge.
Hi, my name is Trevor. I'm Catholic by birth. I love the Catholic Church. I go to church every day. I receive the Eucharist every day. The Mass is the source and summit of my life. And for me, this topic seems like I've never heard somebody like occasional religious practice. We all have to work on our faith. Faith is not easy. It's not like, oh, I come sometime, I go sometime. It's not like the whether I wear this shirt, I don't wear this shirt. I like this, I don't like this. We all have to work on our salvation. People think that, oh, when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. You have to work for it. It's not easy. When I was hungry, you gave me to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. We have to, as a faith, profess what the faith is, what Jesus said. Because somebody says, I'm an occasional person, I like to do this, I don't like to do that. But as a church, or as a priest, or as a pastor, we have to explain to the people what salvation is about. How do we get to heaven? I think, in my opinion, I've been to many churches, as a church, we have failed to explain that to people. We begin to think that faith, everything is easy. We have to make things easy for people. No, salvation has to be worked on. And as individuals, we have to work towards that. Nothing is easy. The last 4 things that will happen. When you die, there'll be judgment, there'll be heaven, there'll be hell, or there'll be purgatory. And we have to work towards salvation, each and every one of us. So when people come and say, okay, I want to do this sometimes, I don't feel like doing this every day. I baptize my child, or I won't baptize my child. Basically, you have to explain to them that this is a work in progress. This is a serious matter.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I absolutely affirm it. It's a very serious matter. I would affirm that we are saved by the grace of God, not through our own actions, and that how people proceed on that journey takes many different forms, and the Spirit is active and present in their lives in many different ways. In terms of the social mission of the church and engagement and participation in God's reign and feeding and caring for those in need, many occasional practitioners are really committed to that vision, are committed to living good lives in service to their communities, and see occasional practice as part of that. We'll talk about things like the story of the Good Samaritan or the Golden Rule as ways that they think about how they want to live their lives, and see participation in Christian communities connecting on these occasions as one of the ways that they pass that on to their children, or have received that themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I take the point. Like, I think I'm trying to express, like, as a challenge. Like, I want to be, say, as a pastor, welcoming and open, but I do feel that I need to, commit and walk with individuals, and I guess a challenge for me in some of the stories too, like a connection of if we're not able to give people what they're coming for, then it's like an unwelcoming or unwarm. And that for me, it's tricky. It's a hard, because no one wants to be unwelcoming and unwarm. But I've had a lot of experiences too where it's just I can't give people what they're looking for in that moment, and I think that they'll go somewhere else. And I don't think that's always necessarily the best.
I think my friend Nick has allowed me to go before him, even though his question will be better than mine. John, thank you for hosting another wonderful Center for Christian Engagement conversation. Sarah, we're so pleased to have you back on the West Coast. Thank you for your awesome research. We had a chance to chat a little bit earlier today about some of this, but as I heard your presentation tonight, I'd love for you to comment, sitting here in Vancouver, which according to the 2021 census is the most secular part of Canada, on occasional religious practice. What happens when we're on our third or fourth generation raised without religion? When the grandmother doesn't say, you need to get that grandkid baptized because grandma hasn't been to church ever. And it's anecdotal, but as a congregational minister in Ontario, I was just so used to the phone ringing, and the funeral director would say, Ross, we want a non-hellfire brimstone funeral for this family. They don't go to church, but they want a pastor. Yep, I'll do one of those. Or the phone rings and someone says, I'm in town visiting grandma and I want to have my kid done. And I was always tempted to say, medium or well done. But we can arrange a baptism. And then I moved to Vancouver as a minister, and those phone calls never came, because there was no occasional religious practice, because people were purely secular. So occasional religious practice, is this a hangover of late stage Christendom? What's coming next?
A great question, and one of the things I hope this research will inspire is comparative case studies in other regions and traditions and time periods. And that's partly because any ethnographic study like this that's really rooted in deeply exploring one case can create some theories, some frameworks. Then the question is, how do those look similar or different in other cases? So I would love to hear more about what this looks like in Vancouver compared to Toronto. And I do think some of the dynamics you name are already visible in this study. We know across the global north, each generation is less religious than the preceding generation in measures of affiliation and practice and belief, and that those dynamics are really pervasive and are not the kind of thing that are easily turned around, because they are extended across generations. And I see that in my own research in families, when I talk to multiple generations within the same family, and can see that the type of religious upbringing they have has shifted over time. So what is the future of occasional religious practice? I think it's important when thinking about that question to recognize that occasional religious practice is not only a modern phenomenon. And maybe I'll point again to that early Christianity period. And I had the opportunity to write a paper about occasional religious practice in the 4th and 5th century. And with my co-author Nathan Chase, we looked at sources from that period in the East and West, and noticed really pervasive patterns of occasional religious practice in this era that's often thought of as kind of a golden era in liturgical studies. And it's not the same kind of occasional practice that we have today. Christmas isn't really a thing at that point, but martyr festivals, that's when everyone's going to the cemeteries for big feasts. So we see this other form of occasional practice in a very different culture, a very different time period, different expression. of the Christian tradition. And therefore, when I think about occasional practice in the future, I expect it will look different. I would anticipate that in Protestant traditions that experience this kind of decline, we would expect that to continue with occasional practice, but we might see more interreligious occasional practice in Canada. As people attend more markers of marriage or funerals or childbirth in other religious traditions, as our communities become more and more diverse. So I expect it will look different in the future, but I would be very surprised if occasional religious practice disappears.
Half of my family, if not most of them, are actually Lutheran. And I deal with them at all times when it comes to my lifestyle. And so I'm always welcoming, even to strangers. But you were saying we are led by God's grace, but through God's grace we also have to act. And when we act, that should be part of our life. It should always be within our life, 24/7. And even if it's divisive, because Christ came with a sword between mother and daughter, you know that verse, that gospel. So keep that at heart. You have to be kind, and most of my friends, we are still befriended, but all these, they say to me, I think you're just a good person being nice. Well, being truthful is not always nice. It can be very divisive, and I have lost friends too, but it's worth it.
Am I the last question? Oh, geez. It's actually not a good question. It's great to see you again, Sarah. And I mean, this is a great panel. Really good presentations this evening. As a former RCI director and member of the Roman Catholic Anglican Dialogue in Canada, this is a bit of blowing my mind in a good way. And so this is a really simple question. I know in Roman Catholic sort of tradition, in the last couple of, I would say in the last decade, say for example in Toronto when I was still doing ministry there, baptismal preparation became essentially mandatory. And that looked different in different contexts at different times. And I'm just wondering, what does that look like in the Anglican tradition, certainly in the Diocese of Toronto? And did that play a factor in any of the folks that you interviewed, perhaps, deciding, well, I'm not going to be involved in this? I, for one, had people, go through that and decide this is not for me, for example. Any thoughts about baptismal preparation for the celebration of that sacrament?
Yes. Well, in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, at the time of this research, there was a lot of variation, and it was really up to the priest in each parish how they would approach baptismal preparation. And that varies a lot with the nature of the parish too. Can this be a group experience? Is it more one-on-one with families? In general, there was a bit of a mismatch between the focus of baptismal preparation and the experience of families. And one of the ways that showed up was that baptismal preparation, and I did speak with 20 different priests about this, often really focused on the baptismal covenant. This beautiful baptismal covenant in the Book of Alternative Services, making really stunning commitments to faith and life and community and the earth and prayer. It's just this lovely set of commitments. And I can understand the desire to focus on that and to really think about what it looks like to live it out every day. But when I spoke with families, they almost never mentioned the baptismal covenant, even if their entire preparation process was centered on it. And in some ways, it could be seen as a key part of the rite as well. And so that wasn't the main motivation for baptism in most cases. So it wasn't the kind of thing that stuck with them. Whereas there was one priest who I spoke with who really kind of got that and approached baptismal preparation in a different way, more focused on meeting people where they were at and taking that as a starting point. So she would focus on the materiality of the rite and say, what do you associate with water? What do you associate with oil or with light? And kind of explore these symbols together. And would read Psalm 139 with families, to talk about that emotional connection and God's provision and care throughout life and all different moments, and would share the story of her baptism and what mattered about baptism to her. And there was space to teach about Christian understandings of baptism, but also to ask the family, what are their stories? What is the interpretation that they're bringing to this experience? And they would walk through the rite as part of that too, and they weren't surprised by any of the commitments they were making or anything that would happen on that day. But when they talked about they're kind of keeping the baptism present in family life, the focus wasn't necessarily on the words of the covenant, but on how do you remember this in relationship with grandparents? How do you remember this as an annual anniversary? How do you build this into the reasons that are connected to this baptism for you? So it's just a different way of thinking about it, and I think it was really rooted in some of these priorities that occasional practitioners were bringing around materiality and emotion and relationship, more than focusing on the covenant, although the covenant's still there, and that commitment is still part of it, that there was sort of a broadening of what could be part of the preparation process. Mm-hmm. So I think the preparation is one of those key moments of hospitality, and sometimes families say, this isn't for me right now too, and that can be a good decision as well. And sometimes a leader might say, maybe this isn't for you right now, and that can be a good decision too, and to have that conversation and that dialogue together.
So I noted that people online could ask questions, and we have one question and two comments that are very similar that I think bring up some of the tension that we've heard here between people who are practicing routinely, who have a particular faith where the theology is so significant, whereas with occasional practitioners it does seem you use the word eclecticism, where the theology isn't as important. So two of the comments are, baptized Catholics have the great gift of the body and blood of Jesus in every Mass. And the second comment makes the same question. Not really a question there, but just saying this is the reality that I have. One of the questions comes from a priest, the other an anonymous attendee. And so there is a real tension there, right, between the actual theology that a church teaches and where you're only going to find that as a routine or intensive practitioner, I think was the language, and where others are going to say we're not at that point. We don't see the theology as that significant. Whatever we're looking for is found in different ways. So I'm not sure, there's not a question in those two comments, but I'm not sure if there's any sort of comment you folks want to make to that. But just sort of stressing a key point of Catholic theology here, right, about what's taking place in the Mass. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I would return to Alisdair's mention of mystery. That what we encounter in the mystery of the Eucharist is something that does take us beyond words, beyond theology, into an encounter with the divine. And that can happen in surprising ways and in very routine ways. Yes. And that theology is more than words in many ways.
And just to play, and at its best, I think it's dialogical, to your earlier point, right? That to have a conversation about what you believe. I love that image that priest in Ontario, in Toronto, is using about what does water mean to you. Like, holy shish kebab, that's a great question.
Yeah, I think for myself, like I struggle with, like, is it the whole thing with the Eucharist or the Mass? But if they're not there, they don't participate. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very much, and I appreciate so much the work of like how to welcome, how to like listen to hospitality. But I think the question is like, are we comfortable with just that's where we leave it, occasional? And I understand to respect the experiences and to learn and to adapt, but for myself, it would be like I'm not comfortable just leaving it there, and to try to, if baptism is what we think it means, and we don't have to theologically understand it, but I think to invite people is sort of to deepen that. I think we are on our journey, but I think if we accept that that's just where we stop, I don't know.
I agree. I don't think that, like for me, where we're sitting right now, this is just my experience of it, is those, we encounter these people for like the first or the third time kind of thing. And hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Yes. And I would say when I say dialogue, I do mean a conversation. It's not just only listening to occasional practitioners,
Right.
It's also listening to the teaching of the church. It is also leaders sharing their own theologies and convictions, and routine and intensive practitioners sharing their faith as well. It is a conversation. I think one of the challenges has been that so for so long, occasional practitioners haven't had a voice in that conversation. So I tend to uphold that voice because it's a voice that hasn't often been heard, not because it's the only voice that matters in this dialogue.
So, and the final question, this will be the final question now, the online question. Does regular routine religious practice always mean in person? That has not been my experience. And there's no more to that question, but I wonder if that means that routine religious practice is going on even when someone's not engaged in a church in a maybe a formal way, or could it mean not in person? Could it be someone virtually attending? I'm not sure. But that's the question. Does regular routine religious practice always mean in person?
In terms of how I define it, I think part of what this question is getting at is the invisibly routine category. So a recognition that some people may be routine, maybe through praying with their children at bedtime, let's say, but they appear occasional because they're not participating routinely in an in-person community. So I do think that's a form of routine, occasional practice that's actually invisibly routine. And then, of course, there's all sorts of forms of online liturgical practice that have also have a long history, but have been especially intense in the last 5 years or so. And I think that would be another form of routine or even occasional practice too.
Well, I think it's time to bring this very generative discussion to a close for now. We will welcome you to walk through these doors at the end and to turn right, and there'll be refreshments. So please do stay and enjoy those refreshments. But I think, I'd suspect there's a lot more questions here, and we can keep this conversation going. But Sarah, I want to thank you for joining us, for coming back to be with us. We really appreciate it. And Father Nick and Reverend Alisdair, thank you for joining in. There's a lot of really fascinating questions going on here about the reality of occasional religious practice, what we hope for in terms of our Christian faith, our own denominational affiliation and what that means. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but what we're seeing is what's taking place as well. And I thank you for reflecting that for us and leading to these questions. So can we thank Sarah and Nick and Alisdair?